right. Hello, business ethics. Today, we are going to talk about Gardiner's classic essay, A Perfect Moral Storm. We'll get into the weeds of Gardiner's argument in a little bit and whether it makes sense and how we could think about where we can push back against it. But before we get into the details, let's get an overall sense of what he's trying to do. Okay, so Gardiner's main point is that even if we could figure out what our moral obligations are with respect to climate change, what we have to do morally to solve the problem, he argues that it's a quote unquote perfect moral storm. So there are a number of distinctive features of climate change as a social problem that make it especially unlikely for us to do the right thing. And the main way he argues for this conclusion is by making the point in various different ways that climate change is a kind of prisoner's dilemma where there's a conflict between what is individually rational for the members of some group to do and what's overall rational for the group as a whole to do. So remember when we talked about prisoner's dilemmas a few weeks back, you always have the chance to either cooperate or defect. And, cooperating is what leads to, if everyone cooperates, that's what leads to the sort of best outcome overall for everyone. But no matter what other people do, it's always in your own sort of selfish interest to defect. And so he's arguing not only is climate change a prisoner's dilemma, and prisoner's dilemmas are hard, but it's a special type of prisoner's dilemma with these special features that make it especially hard for us to do the right thing. Okay, if Gardiner is right, it's extremely important that he's right. That's going to have some consequences for how we should prepare for climate change, for example. But if he's wrong, it's also extremely important that he's wrong, or at least to the extent that he's wrong, it's extremely important that he's wrong. When you're reading Gardiner, I want you to read, and when you're listening to this right now, I want you to think critically. It's easy to just sort of soak stuff up like a sponge and try to memorize the ideas that are presented in some essay. But I want you to, really consider for yourself whether you believe what this guy is saying, and if you disagree, why? How can you push back against the argument that he's making? So while we're talking about the details of Gardiner's argument, I want you to sort of keep that catalog of examples of prisoner's dilemmas that we discussed a few weeks ago. We've got the rat race in sort of working time hours. So, everybody wants to work harder so they can prove to their boss that they're really fit for the job. But, they would be better off if they all cooperated and they decided to, not work really long hours. We've got free rider problems where everybody enjoys the benefits of some social cooperation, but it makes sense for each of them to opt out. So voting or paying your taxes. We've got tragedies of the commons involving sort of public resources that each person can exploit just a little bit, and so on and so forth. So, we have all of these examples we've got price competition was another one that was discussed in the prisoner's dilemma reading. Two firms who could, form a little cartel or agree not to compete over prices, Pepsi and Coca-Cola or whatever. And, it would be in their best interest if they both agreed not to compete over prices, although it wouldn't necessarily be in the interest of consumers. Anyway, so we have this sort of catalog of examples of prisoner's dilemmas sort of in the back of our head. And while you're reading Gardiner and while you're thinking through Gardiner, I want you to ask, is climate change really that different from other types of prisoner's dilemmas? And is it different in a way that makes the sort of standard tools we have at our disposal for solving prisoner's dilemmas sort of not work or hard to implement or something like that? Okay, so think critically, read actively, don't read passively. But let's get to it. Let's get to the details of Gardiner's argument. Okay, so he says there are three storms, that's the metaphor, that characterize climate change. These three sort of sets of features of climate change as a problem that make it especially hard for us to solve, especially hard for us to sort of motivate ourselves to do what we have to do to take care of it. So there's the global storm, which has to do with how the problem is distributed over space throughout the planet. There's the intergenerational storm, which is about how the problem is distributed over time. And then there's the problem of moral corruption, which is sort of different. It's kind of a separate issue from the sort of prisoner's dilemma-y stuff that takes up the majority of the space in the paper. Okay, so let's talk about the global storm, the intergenerational storm, and moral corruption. Okay. Climate change is, he notes, a problem where causes and effects are dispersed over space. So pollution that we emit here in the United States is going to contribute to, for example, sea level rises on the other side of the world, in Indonesia. So ordinarily, if you've got a problem, if you've got a sort of a social problem, it's and any kind of often prisoners' dilemmas take the form of problems that are sort of localized to some space. But that's not the case with climate change. We pollute over here, the effects are felt elsewhere in the world. Okay. I think we can. There's clearly some truth to this. It's possible to push back against it a little bit. So take air pollution, for example. It is closely related to climate change. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's also a sort of byproduct of our burning fossil fuels and our energy use. Air pollution is a problem whose effects are pretty localized and extremely serious. By some measures, 1 in 7 people die of air pollution. By some measures, it is the deadliest thing in the world, and its effects are very highly concentrated, or at least to a great extent, in the areas in which the pollution is emitted. So, some of our sort of pollution-related problems have effects which are very far away from their causes. Others of our pollution-related problems have effects which are very local. You could also take something like the consequences of factory farming. So when in factory farms where pigs and cows live, where you've got 20,000 pigs or 20,000 cows in relatively confined space in a concentrated animal feeding operation, one consequence of confining so many animals together is that you can't dispose of their waste in the way that you would dispose of the waste on a smaller scale farm. So often these deep lagoons are dug, these are sort of artificial underground lakes are dug where the waste of the animals is stored, and the lagoons leach into the groundwater, and it poisons the groundwater of the surrounding area. So, you see all of these sort of health consequences, water cleanliness consequences, and so on in the immediate area surrounding factory farms. We don't experience this directly in New York City because we don't have a lot of factory farms anywhere nearby, but other parts of the country, they feel this in a major way. That is another example of a major driver of climate change, which is where the effects of the driver, the effects of the pollution, the effects of the agent are to a great extent felt locally. So that's something to consider. Gardiner says that the causes and effects are dispersed over space. That's true to some extent, but there's also some ways in which the effects of pollution and the effects of climate change causing activity are localized. Okay. Another way that that climate change is sort of distributed over space is through what he calls the fragmentation of agency. So no one person on Earth today is responsible for any significant portion of climate change. So, there's no one person you can point to and say, oh, that's the bad guy. That's the person who did climate change. So, all we need to do is change that one person's behavior or motivate that person to get in line or something like that. Of course, this is true of prisoners' dilemmas in general. Solving them requires you to coordinate the behavior of at least two people, but often in more complicated real life prisoners' lots of people. Think about voting or paying your taxes, right? But here we're dealing with really fragmented agency. The agents who cause climate change are really distributed all over the world, and so coordinating their behavior is going to be hard for that reason. Again, you can push back against this a little bit, and I think there's some truth. There's clearly some truth to what Gardiner is saying. The question is how much truth, or there are some sort of important qualifications or counterexamples to this claim. There are some collective agents. So, for example, some transnational corporations like Exxon, or industry actors like OPEC, or regulatory agencies, or national governments, the government of China, the government of the US, the government of Brazil, who, if you consider those agents, those are pretty localized. They're contained in a space, in the White House, for example, and they are major drivers of climate change. So we do have some, to the extent that climate change requires us only to coordinate the behavior of the handful of agents who are sort of most responsible for driving climate change. So the leaders of major international corporations, fossil fuel businesses, the governments, the central governments of the world's largest economies. It's not easy to, just sort of walk into a room and tell Joe Biden or the CEO of Exxon or whatever what to do, but it's easier to, at least you can walk into a room and talk to them. It's not, you can get that one person in a room, you can shape their behavior to some extent, whereas it's sort of impossible to sort of coordinate the behavior of all, however many 7 billion or however many people there are on the planet at once. Okay, so there's this problem of the fragmentation of agency. The agents who cause climate change are distributed over a lot of space, but one way of pushing back against this is to say, yeah, but maybe the most important agents, the agents you really need to look at, the agents whose behavior you really need to shape, the leaders of major companies and countries, maybe their behavior isn't so hard to coordinate because there are only so many of them. Okay. Lastly, he makes this point about institutional inadequacy. So often when we solve prisoners' dilemmas, well, it's through repeated interactions with people. Those are the sorts of solutions that are emphasized in that evolution of trust game that we played in class, that website that had the video game on it. Okay. Well, there aren't repeated interactions between all of the parties to climate change, including there aren't any interactions between us and the people who haven't been born yet who are going to be affected by climate change, but we'll get to that point in a second. But even among all the people living today, there aren't repeated interactions between you and every other person in the world. So that way of solving prisoners' dilemmas through repeated interactions, repeatedly playing the game with other people, that is not available to you. Okay, so what are the other solutions to prisoners' dilemmas? Well, one other major solution to a prisoner's dilemma is to have some sort of outside power who can change the incentives. They can change the payouts to people. So, if you might be inclined to shoplift, and there's a prisoner's dilemma for you. You could cooperate and pay for your goods, or you can shoplift and defect and you don't pay for the goods. But if everybody shoplifts, there's no more store. Okay, so shoplifting is How do we deal with shoplifting? Well, in part because we have a government which imposes some costs on potential shoplifters. You get fined or thrown in jail for shoplifting, right? Okay, so one way of solving prisoners' dilemmas is through having some sort of institutional power over all of the parties to the interaction who can go in and through imposing taxes or using the criminal law or whatever, can change the incentives for people so it no longer benefits them to contribute to climate change. Okay. The problem here, Gardiner says, is that we don't have, it's one thing to talk about an institution which would change the incentives for a potential shoplifter. There you're talking about something like a city government, right? Okay, we have city governments. But what sort of institution would it take to change the incentives for everybody on Earth? Well, it would take some kind of world government, right? But we don't have a world government. At least we don't have a world government which is in any obvious way strong enough to impose real costs on potential polluters. Okay, contributors to climate change. Okay, that's Gardiner's claim. Again, you can push back against it a little bit. There's clearly some truth to this. There's no government of the world in the same way that there's a government of New York City. That's true. That said, we do have some international regulatory agencies and financial institutions, for example, that do have some kind of punitive power. They have the power to impose punishments and costs on, everybody on Earth. So think of organizations like the World Health Organization or the International Monetary Fund or the International Criminal Court or even the UN, if they could get their act together or whatever. Okay, so there are these agencies of international governance, and sometimes they really do coordinate the behavior of everyone on Earth to a meaningful extent. So the question is, if we're looking for that sort of solution to a prisoner's dilemma, where you have some central institution which changes the incentives for all of the actors that it governs, do the institutions that we have, the international governing organizations that we have, do they have the power and the capacity to do this? Or, with a little bit of work, would they get that power and capacity? That's the question. Okay. So this is the global storm, the ways that climate change is distributed over space. And as I'm presenting Gardiner's argument, I've also been sort of pushing back against it at various points. Okay. But suffice it to say, Gardiner is, while I've suggested various ways that you could push back against the argument, Gardiner's not making a silly or a foolish or an obviously false point. The point he's making is, in some sense or to some extent, clearly true, namely that the problem is in various ways distributed across space, across the whole globe, and that makes it hard. Good. Okay. Well, not good, but at least we got that far. So the next storm that he talks about is the intergenerational storm. And, if you focus on the details, this sounds like it's a completely separate discussion, but it's really a very similar discussion. The same way that climate change is distributed over space, in terms of its causes and effects, and in terms of the actors who are involved in it and who need to be coordinated to solve the problem. They're not just distributed over space, they're also distributed over time. Some of the people who contributed to climate change lived during the Industrial Revolution. Some of the people who are going to be victims of climate change are going to be born 100 years from now, fingers crossed, right? So, as he says, climate change is a substantially deferred phenomenon. The pollution that we create today is going to be felt primarily in the distant future. And so so what does this mean? What are the consequences of this? One of the consequences of it is that there are people who have a major stake, maybe people who have the biggest stake in what we do today, who can't participate in our decision-making process because they haven't been born yet. So the ordinary ways that sort of democracies and collective decision makers can solve the problems of prisoners' dilemmas, that they can solve collective action problems, those seem to run into this problem here, which is that the people who have the most at stake, or at least the people who have a lot at stake, haven't been born yet. And so we can't incorporate them into our collective decision making. You could, Gardiner doesn't make a comparison to non-human animals, but you might, right? So like, non-human animals don't have a vote. And you could imagine, it's hard to imagine, maybe it's impossible to imagine, but you could imagine that, for example, our animal welfare laws, or the laws governing farmed animals, would be very different if they could vote. And, Gardiner is making a similar point about climate change, that, if people who are going to be born 100 years from now in a potentially poison-choked Earth are going to, or had a say in energy policy today, it would look pretty different. Okay. Again, this is it's to a great extent, or in a lot of important ways, just a straightforwardly true point. It's clear that the people who, as long as humanity sticks around for another couple of generations, the people who are going to be most affected by climate change, who are most affected by our current polluting habits, have not been born yet. And so, we can't guarantee that their interests are going to be taken seriously by bringing them into our democratic decision making. That option just isn't available to us. Okay. Does that mean that there is sort of no way of motivating people today to care about these people in the future? Well, no, it doesn't. To push back a little bit against Gardiner's argument, to see, well, are there any weaknesses in this point, or are there any possible sort of ways around this objection that he's making, or this concern that he's raising? You can ask yourself, when, clearly sometimes people do, in fact, take into consideration the welfare of people in the distant future. Famously, Benjamin Franklin invested a bunch of money in his will in this trust, where the investments wouldn't pay out until some decades, or maybe more than a century, I can't remember the numbers, later. So Franklin, when he was dying and was thinking about how to spend his fortune, was asking himself how he could benefit the people, not just his own children, but people he hadn't met yet, people who hadn't been born yet. So, that's one sort of, somewhat well-known example, just because it's from the biography of a famous person. There is in the Iroquois Confederacy, the sort of democratic organization that was responsible for a lot of the collective decision-making of the Iroquois nations of the United States, of the Northeast. They made decisions according to the principle of the seventh generation stewardship. So maybe you've heard of this, the idea that when we make decisions, we want to think about how it's going to affect the seventh generation. So 7 generations from now, how are these decisions going to be felt? At least from my understanding, I'm not a historian, but from my understanding, the decision makers generally did a reasonably good job of this. They really did care about the 7th generation. So, we have these examples, maybe scattered examples, maybe rare examples, but we have these examples in human history of people giving a shit about people in the distant future and really incorporating that care and concern into their own decision making. So the question is just, when do we do this? And can we make our decision making about climate change like that? One of these sorts of situations, or where people take into account the decisions of people who haven't been born yet, people in the distant future. An interesting question to ask yourself or maybe it's an empirical, psychological question or a historical question in part, but an interesting question to ask yourself is like, when? When do we make decisions that take into account people in the future? And when do we act more selfishly in time, only taking into account people who are alive today? Okay. That's the intergenerational storm. That's the obstacle, that we have this, that, the people who are most going to feel the consequences of our pollution are people who haven't been born yet. And so, among other things, what this means is that we can't guarantee that their interests are going to be taken seriously just by incorporating them into our own democratic processes. So if we're going to guarantee that their interests are taken seriously, we're going to have to do something else. And then the question is what? And I've given some possible historical exemplars, but I leave it up to you. Okay. Lastly, there's what Gardiner calls the theoretical storm, which is just, here he talks primarily after, he calls it a theoretical storm, but after, sticking to the storm metaphor, he mostly makes a point in terms of moral corruption. So, people can be deceived and deluded and distracted and have their motivation sapped from caring about climate change for the reasons that we have talked about. Sometimes it's that there are, sometimes people are sort of made not to care about climate change by bad actors. There's some corrupt politician, or there's some, Lex Luthor-ish, cartoon villain, fossil fuel company executive who's sitting there trying to, think about how to deceive and distract and, demotivate people who otherwise would care about climate change. But sometimes it's just that it's not that there's any bad actors here. It's not that there's any bad guy who's, compelling us not to care about climate change. It's just that we get distracted. We have other things to care about. And, it's easier to, our little moral lizard brains, which were, evolved to help us deal with the social problems that come with small group life in, the ancestral populations of human beings. They didn't evolve for us to, deal with these global problems and to really take to heart the interests of people who haven't been born yet, or people on the other side of the globe, or whatever. It's just hard being a human being stuck in the body with the brain that you're stuck with. It's hard to focus on what matters, to continue to care consistently about the most serious moral problems that we face and challenges that we face, rather than the 1,001 distractions of the day. Again, this is a true point. It's just a question of, how can we, how, if at all, can we overcome this? When have people historically, a good question to ask yourself is, clearly sometimes people historically have been focused on what matters. Sometimes people have gotten up and, gotten involved and taken the most important moral challenges of the day seriously. You can think for yourself of whatever historical examples you like, but clearly this has happened sometimes in the past. So the question is, how can we do that for climate change? Okay. Yeah, I think that's about it. Very good. Okay. I'll talk to you over Zoom if you can make the meeting. Otherwise, I'll see you after spring break. All right.